The operational record dictates a specific sequence of events occurring over a single night. The data confirms the launch and impact of 1,200 individual missiles. The target area encompasses the entire geographic depth of the designated military infrastructure. The physical result is absolute. 50 active military installations did not sustain partial degradation. They were not temporarily disabled. They ceased to exist as functional operational centers prior to sunrise. Simultaneously, the deployment matrix registers 300,000 active duty personnel stationed across multiple forward operating zones. At the commencement of the morning cycle, these units registered a critical supply failure. They possess no resupply vector for kinetic munitions. They possess no incoming liquid fuel. The foundational logistics architecture required to maintain a mechanized fighting force has been neutralized. In standard military taxonomy, an armed formation lacking a supply chain is no longer classified as an operational army. It is an armed crowd. The data completely invalidates the hypothesis of coincidence. The destruction was not the byproduct of statistical probability or a singular defensive miscalculation. It was the execution phase of a highly calibrated strategic campaign. The operation required extensive preparation, sustained intelligence gathering, and synchronized rehearsal. Western intelligence models consistently documented this level of multi-axis coordination as being beyond the adversary's technical capacity. The domestic defense establishment continuously assured its political executive branch that such an event was operationally impossible. Both analytical models failed. They're out. The empirical out of this analytical failure is currently documented on the ground. 50 installations reduced to concrete debris, 1,200 verified impact craters distributed across a landmass smaller than the state of New Jersey, 300,000 personnel occupying forward defensive postures, surrounded by empty ordnance containers, holding positions they cannot actively defend, and lacking the mechanized fuel required to execute a tactical withdrawal. The events of the preceding night do not represent the final engagement of the conflict. They represent the precise moment when the mathematical outcome became a visible reality to any entity willing to analyze the physical data without political bias. The armed forces have not issued a formal surrender. However, the physical reality dictates that a military structure devoid of munitions, fuel, and organizational coherence is incapable of achieving victory. It is an army that simply waits to find out how the operational timeline concludes. The primary analytical question regarding an operation of this magnitude is not what occurred, but the mechanical process of how it was executed. The damage assessments answer the what with absolute physical clarity. The operational challenge lies in understanding how a military organization coordinates the simultaneous engagement of 50 separate hardened targets. These targets were distributed across a geographic area of approximately 22,000 square kilometers. The execution required 1,200 individual weapons to impact within a single operational night, maintaining a targeting fidelity that destroys specific infrastructure rather than merely damaging the exterior perimeter. The answer is located in the intelligence preparation that preceded the physical launch sequence by months and potentially years. Engaging a hardened military installation requires granular architectural data. The attacking entity must possess the exact coordinates of the fuel storage relative to the perimeter fence. They must map the ammunition holding areas in relation to the primary access roads. They must pinpoint the command and control nodes and calculate the orientation of aircraft shelters relative to the prevailing wind directions to maximize the spread of post-strike secondary fires. This level of architectural detail cannot be extracted from standard satellite imagery alone. It demands a sustained multi-source intelligence operation combining satellite reconnaissance, signals intelligence, human intelligence networks, and the exploitation of commercial data sources that inadvertently reveal facility layouts. The impact patterns at all 50 locations confirm that this comprehensive database was fully assembled. Weapons did not impact randomly within the perimeters. They struck specific functional elements, including fuel infrastructure, ammunition storage, runway systems, and radar installations. The execution at Nevatim, the primary operating base for the F-35 stealth fighter fleet located in the Negev, provides the standard model for the operation. 74 individual missile impacts were recorded at this specific coordinate across a strike sequence lasting exactly 110 minutes. The targeting sequence at Nevatim operated on a strict algorithm. The incoming ordnance addressed the base's defensive response capabilities first, systematically neutralizing the radar and fire control systems. Only after the defense was blinded did the sequence transition to the aircraft infrastructure and the aviation fuel systems that represent the base's offensive capacity. Disable the defense, then destroy the offense. That is deliberate operational planning executed with absolute precision to prevent the defending systems from concentrating their countermeasures. The overarching strike package was organized into 5 simultaneous attack axes. Each axis was assigned a specific target category and utilized weapon types mathematically matched to the hardness level of those targets. The first axis contained approximately 350 missiles. It addressed airbase infrastructure across the northern sector, including Ramat David and Megiddo. These facilities were engaged within a concentrated 200-minute window, deliberately denying the Northern Air Defense Network the time required to reload and recalibrate. The second axis consisted of approximately 280 missiles. Its trajectory was aimed at the ground force logistics and command infrastructure located in the central sector. The third axis utilized approximately 220 missiles to strike southern sector installations, including Tel Nof. The fourth axis deployed approximately 200 missiles specifically targeted at the radar and early warning air defense network across all geographic sectors simultaneously. This axis operated in tandem with intense electronic warfare preparation, actively degrading the coverage of the defensive radar arrays mere seconds before the primary kinetic packages arrived. The fifth axis consisted of approximately 150 missiles held in operational reserve. These assets were retained and subsequently deployed against targets that required follow-on engagement or against targets of opportunity that revealed themselves during the initial phases of the strike. The defensive response from the targeted nation achieved interception rates that official military spokespersons have subsequently declined to confirm on the public record. In military analysis, absolute silence regarding interception metrics is highly informative. The available damage data indicates that the effective interception rates fell significantly below the historical figures previously cited for these defensive systems. The failure was not due to a malfunction of technology, but the limits of physical geometry. The combination of simultaneous multi-axis saturation, intense electronic warfare, and specific flight profiles pushed every layer of the defensive network beyond its engineered processing parameters. The Iron Dome system was structurally irrelevant against the high-altitude, high-velocity flight profiles presented by the ballistic weapons. The Arrow 2 and Arrow 3 interceptors were presented with incoming target densities that mathematically exceeded their simultaneous engagement computing capacity. The Patriot batteries, tasked with providing point defense around the most critical installations, exhausted their interceptor tubes and were fully saturated before they could complete their engagement sequences against the very first wave. By dawn, the reconnaissance imagery recorded a landscape unlike any prior conflict in the region. 50 operational military installations displayed the identical signatures of comprehensive functional destruction. Runways were deeply cratered, command structures were collapsed, fuel infrastructure was burning, and secondary explosions from detonating ammunition stocks continued to register on thermal sensors. The multi-base architecture required to support sustained, high-tempo combat operations had been permanently reduced to concrete rubble. The required timeline for reconstruction is measured in months, not days. The most operationally significant consequence is not the physical destruction of the 50 bases. It is the immediate physical condition imposed upon the 300,000 personnel currently occupying the active operational fronts. Modern mechanized warfare operates strictly on a continuous resupply pipeline. It does not function as an isolated entity carrying complete provisions. Supplies flow from national-level storage depots, through intermediate distribution nodes, directly to forward unit positions where they are kinetically consumed. The forward fighting force is merely the terminal point of this chain. The targeting algorithm executed during the night did not strike the terminal point. It systematically dismantled the origin points and the intermediate distribution infrastructure. The 300,000 deployed personnel did not exhaust their ammunition stockpiles during the night. They will exhaust them sequentially over the coming days as existing organic supplies are consumed while the replenishment pipeline remains permanently severed. The consumption metrics dictate a rigid timeline. A standard armored brigade engaged in sustained combat operations requires exactly 400 tons of ammunition per 24-hour cycle. This requirement encompasses artillery shells, tank rounds, infantry munitions, and anti-tank systems. Across multiple divisional scale formations comprising 300,000 troops, the collective daily consumption rate mathematically guarantees that organic vehicle-carried supplies will reach total exhaustion within 72 to 96 hours. Following this threshold, units are required to implement strict rationing protocols. This includes restricting fire to the most critical engagements, conserving anti-tank missiles for confirmed armor contacts, and limiting artillery support to emergency situations. Rationing artificially extends the supply timeline, but simultaneously degrades combat effectiveness in direct proportion to the fire restrictions imposed. The liquid fuel parameters operate on a concurrent accelerated timeline. A Merkava 4 main battle tank requires complete refueling after 500 kilometers of operational transit. The inclusion of required supporting vehicles multiplies this baseline consumption requirement by a factor of 8 to 10 for a complete combined arms formation. With the total destruction of the fuel distribution network, forward deployed formations are currently operating exclusively on the fuel contained within their internal tanks and organic transport trucks. At standard combat operational tempos, this finite reserve restricts all mechanized movement within 48 to 72 hours. The biological requirements of the personnel compound these mechanical failures. The destruction of regional cold storage and ration distribution centers isolates the troops to their individually carried combat ration packs. This represents a definitive 3 to 5 day supply per soldier. Subsequent sustenance requires improvised local procurement, a protocol that diverts available manpower from combat functions, degrades morale, and introduces severe health risks from uncontrolled sourcing in an active conflict zone. The simultaneous convergence of these three supply constraints, ammunition, fuel, and biological sustenance, elevates the situation from a tactical complication to a strategic crisis. The commanding officers managing these formations face a specific matrix of decisions, none of which yield an operational victory. They can continue offensive maneuvers, thereby accelerating the consumption of the finite ammunition supply that separates military function from total helplessness. They can transition into static defensive postures, marginally extending the supply timeline while entirely conceding the operational initiative to the opposing forces. Alternatively, they can initiate a tactical withdrawal toward regions retaining residual logistical function, deliberately accepting the territorial and psychological costs of a visible retreat. The selection is merely a choice between varying velocities of operational defeat. The institutional culture governing American crisis management operates on a rigid three-tier sequential protocol. The initial phase is purely diagnostic, focusing on raw information gathering and damage assessment. The secondary phase involves the rapid development of military options. The tertiary phase, which definitively reveals the true architectural boundaries of an international alliance, is the evaluation of those military options against rigid political and logistical constraints. Following the destruction of the 50 installations, Washington's evaluation of these constraints has generated a set of operational conclusions that the Allied leadership is finding structurally difficult to process. The primary emergency response option is the activation of the Military Airlift Command. Heavy transport aircraft are mechanically engineered to move high-value, low-volume cargo at intercontinental speeds. They can effectively deliver precision-guided munitions, specialized electronic hardware, and critical replacement parts. However, the immediate crisis is not a shortage of microchips, it is a shortage of mass. The fuel requirement necessary to restore even minimum operational mobility to 300,000 immobilized troops is measured in hundreds of thousands of liters. A strategic airlift asset moves cargo measured in tens of tons per sortie. This presents an insurmountable mathematical barrier. Furthermore, the physical throughput capacity of the receiving infrastructure has been severely degraded. The operational air bases that survived the primary strike sequences now possess cratered runways and destroyed offloading facilities, reducing their capacity to receive incoming cargo to a fraction of their standard operational tempo. The physics of the problem dictate that airlift cannot restore a logistics system that has been structurally erased. The secondary option involves direct American military intervention. This protocol would authorize the utilization of American strike assets to systematically degrade the adversary's missile launch infrastructure, thereby reducing the capacity for follow-on strikes. Washington has evaluated the risk calculus of this option and classified it as currently unfavorable. Initiating direct kinetic action against the adversary's sovereign territory triggers three immediate systemic reactions. First, it activates the Strait of Hormuz closure scenario, injecting a permanent risk premium into the global energy market that current economic structures cannot absorb. Second, it immediately activates retaliatory strike options against American military installations located in Qatar, Bahrain, and Kuwait. The identical precision ballistic systems that successfully bypassed the Arrow and Patriot networks to level 50 Allied bases possess the exact range and capability to replicate that destruction upon American assets. Third, it initiates an escalation dynamic lacking any defined termination point, short of a conflict scale that the American political executive is strictly unwilling to authorize. This risk assessment is visibly translating into physical movement on the ocean. American carrier strike groups, historically utilized to project regional dominance, are actively repositioning. Pentagon spokespersons are currently experiencing extreme difficulty characterizing these naval movements as standard or routine. The operational reality is that maintaining forward naval positioning within the verified envelope of Iranian anti-ship missile systems now carries an unacceptable mathematical risk. The carrier groups are withdrawing to extended standoff distances. While carrier aviation can still deploy from these extended coordinates, the kinetic contribution diminishes severely in direct correlation to the extended flight range. Furthermore, the psychological signal transmitted by a multi-billion-dollar naval armada physically retreating from a threat perimeter is instantly logged and analyzed by every geopolitical observer in the hemisphere. Consequently, a highly specific diplomatic transmission has been routed from Washington to Tel Aviv. It utilizes the precise, calibrated language that sovereign governments employ when delivering definitively unwelcome parameters. The communication confirms that American support remains conceptually committed, and material provision will continue strictly up to the physical limits allowed by the degraded supply chains. However, the transmission explicitly dictates that direct American military engagement against the adversary is entirely removed from the operational table. For a regional government that constructed its entire multi-decade security architecture upon the foundational assumption that American military backing functions as an unconditional constant, this diplomatic cable lands with the devastating force of a strategic revelation. The ultimate lesson of the night is not merely military, it is geopolitical. The backing of the superpower is not unconditional. It never was. The conditions merely remained theoretical until the previous night, when 1,200 precision strikes made them visible. The operational data requires a fundamental reassessment of the adversary's primary strategic doctrine. Analysis of Tehran's decision-making matrix under pressure indicates that the adversary does not seek to achieve a conventional military victory. They are not pursuing the physical occupation of Israeli territory, the total annihilation of the state apparatus, or the acquisition of defined geographic objectives that can be measured on a tactical map. They are executing a strategy of exhaustion. This doctrine is precisely engineered to systematically degrade the capacity and the political will to sustain the current conflict. The objective is to extend the operational timeline until the compounding military and economic costs mathematically exceed what the domestic society and its primary global patron are prepared to absorb. This is not a secondary alternative adopted due to a lack of conventional kinetic capability. It is a first-choice strategic architecture that reflects a highly sophisticated, data-driven understanding of the target's specific structural vulnerabilities. Israel is geographically compact. It operates an exceptionally expensive, technologically advanced military apparatus that cannot function without continuous, uninterrupted intercontinental resupply from Washington. Furthermore, its ground force architecture relies heavily on a civilian reserve mobilization model. While highly effective for short-duration crises, maintaining 300,000 reserve personnel in active combat deployment extracts severe, immediate economic penalties across the domestic, industrial, and commercial sectors. Operating within a democratic political system also imposes hard, verifiable limits on public tolerance for sustained casualties and indefinite economic disruption. Each of these structural characteristics functions as a specific pressure point that the doctrine of exhaustion is mathematically designed to exploit. The destruction of 50 operational bases and the logistical stranding of the forward troops does not represent the terminal point of this campaign. It functions strictly as an operational milestone. It provides empirical verification to the adversary that the exhaustion threshold is physically reachable and that the kinetic tools required to reach it are fully operational. The subsequent phase of this campaign is entirely predictable based on this established doctrine. The targeting algorithms will systematically shift pressure against the economic and social load-bearing structures of the state. The primary vectors will include the civilian energy infrastructure that sustains urban life, the central financial processing architecture that funds the continuous military mobilization, and the domestic transportation networks required to connect the country's economic centers. The contrast in strategic cultures dictates the current operational imbalance. Israeli strategic culture has historically optimized its forces for rapid, decisive kinetic action. The operational templates are based on the Six-Day War model, the Entebbe raid model, and the surgical strike model. These specific approaches are optimally suited for short-duration, high-intensity crises against adversaries possessing limited capacity for sustained response. However, they are fundamentally maladapted for a conflict against an adversary whose entire architecture is designed specifically to outlast, rather than directly confront, incoming kinetic power. When the operational parameters of a conflict transition from a test of tactical decision to a raw mathematical test of endurance, the previously established advantages are neutralized. Total air superiority, advanced technological edges, and the theoretical backing of a global superpower decrease in operational value. They are systematically superseded by the advantages Iran has meticulously constructed through 5 decades of geopolitical isolation, absolute self-sufficiency in weapons production, institutional strategic patience, and an operational doctrine explicitly calibrated to win the long game by ensuring the opponent simply runs out of resources, infrastructure, and public endurance. The destruction of 50 operational military bases and the logistical immobilization of 300,000 troops represent a strategic inflection point. These specific physical events accelerate a global restructuring of power relationships. The international order processes this data and recalibrates. In Moscow, the strategic calculus is strictly mathematical and highly favorable. The operational data validates Russian defense technology. The Caliber cruise missiles utilized in the strike sequence successfully penetrated American-supported defensive architecture. This performance generates immediate procurement interest from foreign governments evaluating precision strike capabilities. That specific interest translates directly into defense contracts, diplomatic relationships, and strategic leverage across multiple geopolitical regions. In Beijing, the intelligence apparatus catalogs the American response matrix. The Chinese strategic focus centers on documenting the adversary's decision-making process under severe operational pressure. The established pattern carrier group displacement, logistically constrained resupply protocols, and the verified political reluctance to authorize direct kinetic engagement provides a precise map of American operational limits. This map will systematically inform Chinese military planning in every theater critical to their national interests. For the broader international community, specifically the governments of the global south, the foundational narrative of American unipolarity has been empirically tested. The preceding assumption dictated that alignment with Washington guaranteed a security umbrella robust enough to deter any military adversary. 50 destroyed installations and 300,000 stranded personnel serve as the concrete physical refutation of that specific guarantee. Foreign governments that were previously pressured into alignment are currently rewriting their foreign policy calculations based on this new operational reality. Concurrently, the global economic structure is forcibly adjusted. The demonstrated capability to execute precision strikes at this scale, combined with geographic control over the Strait of Hormuz, injects a permanent risk premium into international energy pricing. Every percentage point of this premium functions as a direct tax on energy importing economies. The resulting inflation, reduced economic growth, and social instability will generate immense pressure on international governments to force a resolution that accommodates the strategic interests of the adversary. The multipolar global architecture has physically arrived. It was not established through diplomatic negotiation or gradual evolution. It was established through the operational demonstration that the military foundation of American hegemony has reached the absolute limits of its projection capability. The Middle East, previously the primary theater for demonstrating American power, now functions as the primary theater demonstrating the boundaries of that power. 1,200 missiles, 50 bases erased, 300,000 troops stranded without ammunition, a Pentagon operating without an immediate operational countermeasure. These are not isolated data points within a continuing narrative of regional military dominance and strategic primacy. They represent the exact physical moment when that specific narrative terminated and a new one initiated. The adversary currently holds the strategic initiative. They maintain it through a self-reliant military-industrial complex built under absolute isolation. They maintain it through a precisely calibrated doctrine of exhaustion, and they maintain it through the demonstrated operational willingness to employ kinetic capability at a scale that leaves the existing defense architecture temporarily paralyzed. The previous geopolitical era has concluded. The parameters for the next generation are currently being established on the ground.